This is day 2 of my £2 for 2 days budget meal challenge. If you missed out on part 1, please follow the link in this card or in the video description to see part 1, which has got all of the ingredients and the shopping and all of the rules and permissions, which I will just quickly recap on screen now. So day 2 starts with breakfast. So we've still got 1.5 bags of flour, and I may have made a mistake buying this much flour, but what about if we do something a bit different? Instead of just eating starch and lots of more starch on this 2-day experiment, how about if we extract some of the protein from this? You've probably seen this on other places. We're going to make some seitan. So yeah, I don't know how much flour that is, about probably 3 cups, and we're going to add probably 2.5 cups of water. So we're going to make quite a wet dough. Let's see how that goes. I think probably a bit more than that. Perhaps not quite as wet as that. That's fine, we've got plenty of flour. I will just shake in a bit more. That's about right, I reckon. And then we're going to turn that out and knead it to develop the gluten. So I'm only using plain flour here, which won't have the highest level of gluten in it compared to something like bread flour. But it'll still have enough gluten in there that we can do this wheat gluten extraction with it. Just keep on kneading and the gluten will eventually develop and we'll end up with a less sticky dough. That's the theory anyway. In fact, you know what I might do here? I'm going to put that back in the bowl now. We're going to break out the handheld mixer with dough hooks on it. And now we've got a dough that is stretchy, possibly a little bit on the sticky side, but it's very, very stretchy and stringy. See how stretchy and sticky that is? Right, so we've got a really nice soft ball of dough there, which I'm just going to form into a ball like that, and then we're going to place that into a bowl of cold water. Needs enough water to cover it completely. We'll put a lid on that and we're going to soak that for 2 hours. Right, this ball of dough has been resting in the water for a couple of hours now, and it's gone really, really soft, and you can actually see the starch is starting to wash out of it. So what we need to do now is really carefully lift it out, which is not that easy, and we'll transfer it into a bowl of clean water. And now I'm just going to massage it to wash out the starch, and we're going to have to wash it 5 or 6 times like this until nearly all of the starch is washed out of the dough, and all we're left with is the gluten, which is the protein from the flour. Apparently this went viral on TikTok recently, but of course it's a very, very much older tradition than that. Making seitan from wheat flour is centuries old. Okay, I think that's about as much as is going to come out on the first wash. So we'll now transfer back to the first bowl for the second wash, if that makes sense. And this stuff here, this is all the starch that washed out. So you can make stuff with this, and I'm going to save it, the starch from the first wash. I'm going to do this over the sink, so back in a moment. So I'll set that aside, and it will settle down, and the starch will actually settle out. So back to the washing. Let's see how we get on here. Yeah, this is hardly washing any starch out now. So yeah, I would say we're there. And what we've got now is this kind of mass of stringy, that is the gluten from the wheat. It's quite remarkable, the transformation, isn't it? and just let it rest for a few minutes while I tidy up the mess I've made. Day 2 breakfast, and we're going to try something a bit different. This is the starch that came off of the wheat gluten that I washed, and as you can see it's separated into a fairly dense white layer of starch, in fact a very dense layer, a less dense layer, and then a clear layer. I'm going to pour off that clear layer and then mix this starch with some water. Apparently you can make crepes out of it. I'm going to have a go at that. I'm losing some of the top layer as well, but not worrying too much about that. I've got to say, it doesn't smell great. It smells like wallpaper paste. Well, I suppose it is. So I'm going to try and stir it up. It's really weird. You can't stir it. It does that whole non-Newtonian thing that you get with cornstarch. We'll put a bit of that in a jug. We apparently do need to dilute it again with water, but I won't use too much. And let's get a pan hot and try frying it. The only fat I have is this leftover bacon grease from yesterday, so I'm going to use a little bit of that. Well, I didn't expect it would go transparent. And sticking to a non-stick pan, which is quite a feat. Yeah, I don't think so. Even if it cooks, that's not a texture I want for my breakfast. Okay, we're going to go back to plan A. And plan A is this. This is the bread I made yesterday. I'm going to cut some really thin slices of this. I am fairly sure the reason this bread didn't rise very well is because I put too much yeast in. And I think it's because the bread smells very yeasty, very almost alcoholic. And I think the yeast just got to a point where it stopped. And it probably stopped because it had reached saturation of the kind of alcohol and CO2 level that yeast creates. I'm going to put bananas on here. I haven't got any sugar, I haven't got anything else to adjust the flavour. So it really is going to be quite a basic banana sandwich. I'm going to smoosh that down a little bit. Okay, I'll make another one of these and then fry it. Right, that's my last little bit of bacon grease in the pan there. Just going to get that warmed up and then just plonk those sandwiches in there and fry stroke toast until golden. Right. Well, I feel like this could do with maple syrup or something, but we got what we got. So, fried banana sandwich. It's got a nice crispness to it. Yeah, it's alright. It's definitely just missing something. Interestingly, the flavour of that bacon in the fat is almost imperceptible. I do actually think bacon would go okay with this, but I'm not going to go cook some now. Not as pleasant as yesterday's breakfast, but it'll do. Right, okay, well I'm going to finish this and then we'll go and prepare something for lunch, and I'm going to take that out with me, I think. Now just on its own like this gluten is going to be very bland and just like a block of rubber. So what I actually need to do is give it some texture and flavour. Now I got this tip from a channel, I can't remember the name of it, but I will link it in the video description. And what we need to do is braid it and then knot it, and that will give it a stringy texture, which is somewhat like chicken flesh, and it will then we'll cook it in some stock, in the stock that we made earlier, the kind of broth. So I just need to braid this as tight as I can, or plait it, as we would probably say here in the UK. Plaiting and braiding, same thing. Okay, and then tuck the end of the plait back through itself to kind of lock it in. So we've got a long strand of plaited gluten now, and now we're going to Just massage it out into a longish rope and tie a knot in it in the middle. And pull that as tight as we dare. And another knot. And another knot. See if we can squeeze these out a little bit and get another knot out of that. We might do. Kind of tuck them back through themselves like that. So we're going to cook that knot in the broth we made earlier. Right, the broth is bubbling away. I actually managed to get one more knot into the gluten. So that goes into the broth. We'll just turn that down to a simmer. And that's going to bubble away in there for an hour. Okay, after almost an hour's cooking, it's interesting how much it's swelled up. But what we're going to do now is take that out of there. It has actually firmed up a lot. I'm just going to let that cool completely, and the remainder of the broth, which is reduced down quite a bit. And then once that's cool, I'll marinate it in the broth overnight. So this Seitan wheat gluten, well, it helps when you're making this if you have soy sauce and all sorts of lovely things to flavour it with. I don't have any of that, but so what I've actually got is what I could improvise at the time. Well, it kind of comes apart into stringy bits. What's happening here is not exactly like chicken, is it? But it's also not exactly unlike chicken. So I'm going to tear some of this up. I'm going to try cooking it and see what we can actually do with this. I'm going to make some lunch and take it out with me today and just see if we can find one or two other things to munch on. It smells like it's going to taste nice because all of that vegetable stock that I made has concentrated into it. So yeah, I'm hopeful. Now imagine it's going to cook down a bit because it's still quite moist. So I'm going to use about half of it here and we'll save the other half for later. But I'm just going to tear that up so it's kind of like a shredded chicken type texture. And of course we're going to be frying it with bacon. Now I appreciate that that means it won't be vegetarian anymore. But the objective of this exercise I'm doing over this couple of days is not vegetarianism, it's budget consciousness. In fact, I'm going to use the fattier parts of the bacon to try and render out a decent amount of fat here because I need some fat for the other part I'm going to make today. So let's pick out the fattiest parts of the bacon, kind of the opposite of what you might normally do. And we'll save the meatier parts for the final meal of the exercise, which is going to be dinner time this evening. Now, as this bacon fat renders out, I'm going to spoon it off, just so we don't lose it. Because I will be frying other ingredients in this pan, along with the bacon once it's a bit better done. But I don't want that fat to soak into those other ingredients, not all of it anyway, because I actually need this for something else. And now that it's starting to cook a bit, I'm going to just cut it up into smaller pieces. This will assist the fat in coming out, both just by giving it more surface area, but also smaller pieces will contact the pan better. And there's a lot of kind of fatty meat here, but if you consider the overall fat content of my diet this 2 days, it's actually considerably lower than it would normally be. If this was just pork, I'd be adding a bit of salt to help draw the fat out, because that does assist with the rendering process. But of course it's bacon, which is already quite salty. Oh, Eva, honestly. The pieces that are just pure fat, I'm going to take out, because rather than eat them inside of my thing I'm making, which is going to be a kind of a pasty, I'm actually going to blend these into the pastry for a bit more shortening in there. So we've got that, which is going to go into the pastry, and now my seitan is going to go in, and we'll fry it together with the remaining bacon to pick up a bit of the flavour from there. Immediately you can see it's soaked up the fat that was in there. And turn the heat right down, because there's a couple of more things to go in there. So I'm just going to have a carrot chopped up into half moon slices. And then I got some more of this wild garlic. I'm just going to use the stem pieces in here because they're a bit sweeter and they've got a little bit of crunch to them. The leaves tend to go bitter if they're overcooked. The stems are just like onion really. Okay, so those bits can go in. I'm just going to gently cook that now, just to soften that garlic and take some of the harsh flavour off of it, and just to soften the carrots a little bit as well. Well, I'm curious as to what this seitan tastes like now it's been fried with bacon. So let's take a piece that's got a little bit of colour on it and give it a taste. It's quite a lot softer than it was before we started heating it. That tastes right, kind of like the texture of mushroom. Now, tiny little bit of flour in there. And I'm just going to fry that in the remaining fat that's lurking around on top of the meat and stuff, just to make sure that flour is cooked. So a little bit of vegetable broth from yesterday. I'm just going to deglaze the bottom of the pan there, get all of the flavour off of it and cooked into the contents here. And that flour should just thicken it up and make a very slight gravy or sauce. Now it's a pasty we're making, and that always has, well, usually white pepper, but I've got black pepper, so a good grind of black pepper in there for flavour. Okay, just drawing it to the side of the pan here so I can kind of get an idea of how much pastry I need to make to enclose that. A little bit of salt, because actually that seitan has soaked up a lot of flavour from the bacon, so we're going to need some salt to bring that back out again. That's going to be my filling for my pasty. I need to let that cool, or else it'll just make the pastry soggy when we add it in. First, those little bits of bacon fat. Chop those fairly small. We're going to have a cup and a half of flour. And there isn't enough fat in here to give me a really light and crispy pastry. Even with the additional rendered bacon fat, there isn't going to be enough fat in there. So to help that pastry rise a little bit, I'm going to put in a chunk of this fresh yeast as well. And so it's going to be kind of halfway between a pastry and a bread, I suppose. Now, and then I'm going to add most of the rendered fat that came out of the bacon. I do need to save a little bit because I'm going to use it for glazing the top. Blend that together. Actually, that's not too bad. And now I'm just going to blend it and add a tiny bit of cold water as we go. Cool. Yep, so we've got a ball of dough. I can actually see little flecks of bacon in there. That's going to be really nice, actually, I think. Now, ordinarily, you wouldn't need pastry too much because it makes it tough. Normally, you would favour a kind of crumbly pastry. But for a pasty, I do like it to have a bit of resilience so that it can be picked up and eaten in the hand. Anyway, so that's my pastry. That's my ball of dough. I'm actually just going to cover that up and just let that yeast work for a little bit. So it's rested a little bit. Yeah, it does feel like it might have puffed up a little bit from that yeast, because I actually think the fat level in here is probably going to be okay. So we'll just gently roll that out and try to aim for a fairly neat circle. You can see the little chunks of bacon fat in there. So that looks about the right diameter for that amount of filling. And just before I put that filling in, I've just got some sage, just 1 leaf of sage, which I'll just crush and tear up. And a tiny sprig of thyme, which again, I'm just going to pull the leaves off and crush them as I put them in. Pile that into the middle. Okay. And then just going to make a little hole in the middle there, into which I will just put 1 spoonful baked beans. I'm going to lose all the sauce out of them, just the beans. So we'll just throw in a few beans in the middle there. Important to get a good seal on this, so I'm going to brush all the way around the edge with water to moisten that pastry. That will help it stick to itself. Good. We'll try and squeeze out any air pockets. And it might seem like I've got a lot of pastry on the edge there, and I have. But there's a reason for this, and it's to give a nice crimped edge. I'm told that in Cornwall, the tin miners used to take pasties down into the mines and eat them down in the mine. And because they didn't have very clean hands, the crimp... I'm making a real mess of this. Let's try that again. The crimp would be discarded, so the crimped edge would be just something to hold on to while you eat, and they would just eat the filling. Not bad. Not the neatest crimped edge, but never mind. Now I just need to carefully transfer that to my baking tray. That is a magnificent sized pasty, gotta say. The last little bit of bacon fat that I reserved, I'm going to brush on top, and hopefully that will just help it brown. That's going to go in the oven, I don't know, 180 for half an hour, just until it's golden, until that pastry is crisp and cooked. Just so it doesn't explode, a couple of tiny steam vents in the top there. Okay, in the absence of an egg wash, which we don't have, that's about as golden as we can expect that pastry to go. It's okay. It's actually puffed up quite a bit. It has browned on the bottom. So I'm just going to let that cool down a little bit now, and then we'll pack it up, and I'm going to go out and try and do a bit more foraging. Right, this little stream here, take note of this because we're going to meet this stream later on when it becomes a river. I think I can cross about here. Yep, that wasn't too bad. So we're heading off to Riverhamble Country Park. So here's a wild plant that's worth mentioning. This is Solomon seal. I could dig this up, and underneath there's a starchy root that can be cooked and eaten. I don't have permission to dig up plants here though, so I won't. I don't know about you, but okay, there's a lot of pastry there, but that looks pretty good. That is really good. Now I didn't put any salt in the pastry because there was quite a lot of salt in the filling from that bacon, and I did add some salt, but I've actually brought some, well, mixed salt and pepper with me, and since I don't have an upper limit for the amount of pepper that I like, I'm essentially just adding salt here. Look at that crust. It's halfway between pastry and bread. That yeast has just worked a little bit and given it a bit of bounce, which is fantastic. The Seitan has very little texture actually in here. You can't really tell you're eating it. But the flavour of the bacon and that broth permeates the whole thing. And those carrots have just cooked lovely and tender. then for kind of dessert, well, I haven't got any apples, but I've got a nice crunchy carrot. It's kind of a shame that there isn't any fruit around at this time of year, but that's just the way it is, apart from a few things like this. This is knee holly, or butcher's broom. It's a relative of asparagus. It's a very, very prickly plant. And that has berries on it, but they are poisonous. So, we'll leave those for the birds. Well, well. By which I mean, that used to be a well. Well, still is a well. And I think that's another one there. Obviously used to be a dwelling here of some sort, because there's a little remains of a brick wall there. Maybe it was a little chapel or something, because there's a yew tree here, and you will quite often get yew trees next to chapels, so maybe there was a little chapel here or something, who knows. Although the presence of a well here suggests habitation, I think. Really rather impoverished for fungi. And spring is not the best time of year for fungi anyway, but there are certain species that you can find at this time of year. Just not today and not me, apparently. Okay, and this body of water here is the River Hamble, the tidal Hamble. Essentially the same body of water that I walked across further upstream. Admittedly, that was the smaller of two branches that I crossed, but this is the River Hamble, and it's tidal. So it's brackish here, which means further downstream, if I brought a bit of bacon and a bit of string, we could have caught some shore crabs, and shore crabs are edible. I've done that before, but not this time. So, the other half of my pasty, still slightly warm. Let's get stuck in. I'm going to put the camera off now because I need two hands for this. So yeah, if you had extremely dirty hands, you can eat a pasty just holding onto the crust like that. That's apparently what people used to do in the tin mines. And then they'd just throw that bit of crust away. I'm not going to throw that away because I might have a nibble on that on the way back. It now being May, there are plenty of hawthorn flowers, or mayflowers. Yes, this is actually the plant called mayflower. And hawthorn flowers and the young shoots are supposedly edible. People used to eat them and call them bread and cheese. I've tasted them, they don't taste like either bread or cheese, which is weird. This is going to be the last meal we make out of this set of ingredients, and it's going to be again a bacony, carroty, wheaty thing, because that's what we got. Got a good amount of bacon left. I'm going to put that in the food processor. Okay, that's good. I don't want to completely pulverise that into sausage meat. I've got those carrots that I roasted yesterday, didn't really know what I was going to do with them, and we'll do the same with those. Just shredded into smallish pieces. We've got the remaining seitan. Yeah, I think only half of that, because otherwise we're going to end up with too much food. Good, sort of minced seitan texture. So I'm just going to start frying that over a medium heat. The fat that comes out of the bacon will hopefully be enough for everything else that needs frying. The plant with the white flowers here, in fact here and everywhere, is called three-cornered leek. I'll show you why it's called that in a moment, but we accidentally introduced this to our garden in a plant we bought from a garden centre, and it's a hugely invasive plant. It's gone everywhere and we can't get rid of it. So it's spread all the way around here. It's managed to get itself over there. If there is a plus side to that, it's that this plant is edible. It is just an onion, a species of onion or garlic, and so the whole plant is edible. Just need to be a little bit careful I'm not digging up daffodils, because those are not edible. But here we go. So that's three-cornered leek. And I'll show you, well, you can see why it's called three-cornered. All of the leaves and stems have got a triangular cross-section. The leaves and bulbs are edible, and this is why it spreads so terribly, because even when you dig it up, these little offshoot bulbs break off and you end up leaving them behind in the soil, and they grow into new plants. So a bit of a lost cause really in our garden now, but there it is. Anyway, going to be using some of that today. But as a cautionary tale, do not introduce this plant to your garden. So these three-cornered leeks, I've just given them a wash, and like every other kind of leek, they've got a tendency to collect dirt in the middle there, so I have washed that out best I can. I'll stop about there, I think. And I'll just show you. So that's the three-cornered cross section there, if you can see that. I'm just going to shred these up small, bulbs and all. Yeah, they smell like a very mild spring onion. As that bacon starts to render now, I can turn the heat up a bit. But we did select the really fatty bits for making the pasty, so there's not a lot of fat to come out of this. I have to be careful it doesn't burn. I may actually just add a little bit of this broth that we made yesterday, and then that can go back to frying once the fat has come out of the bacon. And some marjoram. Marjoram is related to oregano, or oregano if you prefer. I'll just snip that in. Pepper, of course. We'll hold off on salt for the moment because the bacon is quite salty. And we're going to try and make some pasta to go with this. Now, I know this isn't the right flour for pasta, but we will still get something. We'll get some kind of noodles. This flour is very golden yellow. 1 cup of flour, and then just going to add about 1/3 of a cup of cold water. Let's see where we get to on this. I'm going to make a really stiff dough. Tiny bit more water, just a little splash. I reckon that's it, yep. Just bring that dough together by hand. Just kneading it in my hands because it's quite a small amount of dough. So this dough, I've just been rolling it, the camera wasn't recording, just been rolling it and folding it on this sheet with no additional flour. And what we've ended up with is quite a smooth dough, but it's very stretchy and it keeps springing back. I'm just going to let that relax now for a bit. And just by leaving this dough every now and again and coming back to it to roll it some more, I've managed to stretch it out really thin and pliable. I'm just going to keep on doing that. Not doing it all in one go, just rolling it a bit, leave it to relax, come back and roll it a bit more while I'm keeping an eye on the pan, of course. And we've got a very, very pliable sheet of dough there. So all these vegetables are cooked now. There was some oil that comes out when you squeeze the mixture. It's a mixture of oil and water. And what I've done now, I've just added about a tablespoon of flour to the middle of the pan, and I want to try to fry that off. Just let that cook a little bit before we add any liquid. And then the liquid is just the remainder of our vegetable broth, and also the remainder of the broth that we used for simmering the seitan. Get that all mixed well together, and that flour should just thicken this to a kind of a sauce. That's the theory. Right, that's the sauce. I'm going to turn that right down now, just let that blip away to continue cooking. Over here with this pasta, I'm going to cut that in half now. And this really is a case of just roll and then relax. I do actually have a pasta machine which I could break out, but I can't be bothered to unpack it. Now I am actually tempted to cut this pasta into sheets and assemble a kind of lasagna type of thing and bake it in the oven, but I think without a proper white sauce and tomato sauce, I think it would be a bit of a sad affair. So here's how we're going to cut this into noodles. I'm going to dust it with a bit of flour, just to stop it sticking to itself. And then I'm just going to roll it up like a Swiss roll. So just doesn't even have to be tight. In fact, it's probably better if it isn't. Just roll that up like that. And then with a nice sharp knife, I'm just going to cut that into ribbons. Nice little thin ones. And that'll look like it's coming off in solid blocks, but actually we can shake those out and we've got kind of like tagliatelle or something. It doesn't even really matter if we tear a few of them while we're unravelling them. And there we go, pasta without a pasta machine. Now this sauce is all but done. One last thing is I'm just going to throw in these baked beans, because the tomato sauce here from these beans is just going to enrich it a little bit, and beans and pasta goes okay as far as I'm concerned. It's quite a lot of sauce there. I think that'll be okay. Which is actually perfect timing because the water has just come to a boil. And this will cook really quickly, so I'm going to be careful. Drop it in a few bits at a time, and it will float up. I'm just going to give that a little jiggle just to make sure none of it's caked together or stuck on the bottom of the pan. Lid on, and we'll boil that for about 4 or 5 minutes, no longer. Okay, that pasta's done. Straight out of the water into there. And it's going to take a little bit of this starchy water with it, which will loosen up this sauce in the pan. Okay. I mean, there's a lot of sauce there for a small amount of pasta, but that's not a bad thing. Let's get that to the table and serve it. Right, there's actually way more here than I can eat. So there might be some leftovers for a midnight snack or something like that. But anyway. Right, I will have some more pepper on that. But we'll taste it before we decide about salt. Well, here we go. Actually, that's really tasty. Doesn't need any more salt. There was quite a lot of salt in that bacon. And of course I did boil the pasta in salted water. Pasta made with this kind of flour is really, really delicate, actually. Texture is actually quite similar to rice noodles. Super tasty. I think those 3-cornered leeks have really filled out the flavour a lot. Yep, I actually really like that. And I think that would have been actually quite nice assembled as a lasagna. That was alright. Okay, right. I'm going to turn the camera off now and have some seconds. In a minute we'll head back to the studio. We'll talk about what went well, what went not so well, what we got left over, and conclusions. Okay, so that's the end of day 2. That was quite an exhausting exercise. I did quite a lot of walking. So just to review the shopping choices here, the availability of fats for cooking was a serious limitation here. It would have been nice to have some butter, and I could have made some scones or something like that. The only fat I had was from the bacon, and there wasn't much of it. When you're shopping for a very limited budget like this, value for money is not a simple calculation, because there are like 4 different factors in competition. There's the whole energy thing, how many calories are you going to get from the food? The nutrition, so the actual nutritional value of the food, so that's all about protein and fibre and vitamins and other nutrients. Then there's flavour. Obviously you can buy just plain flour and lard, and that's got all of the energy you need, but that's not going to be very interesting to eat. And then there's versatility as well, which kind of comes from having a variety of ingredients. So I could have bought 10 bags of flour, and that would have been enough energy for a week, but of course again you haven't got other things to combine with that. You're not actually going to be able to make interesting meals out of it. Other lessons: I used too much yeast in my bread and it stopped rising because it poisoned itself. That's why it smelt alcoholic. I probably could have just bought 1 kilo of flour And maybe if I dropped one or both of the bananas, I could have bought something else more useful and versatile, such as potatoes. But then potatoes aren't such good value in terms of food energy on a budget of this scale. The other thing is, Seitan is okay, but I don't find it to be a very convincing meat analogue. Everybody says it looks like chicken, and it does kind of look like chicken, but the texture is really more like mushrooms when they've been cooked down and reduced to a more dense consistency. So let's rate the 6 meals that I had in order. So on day 1, the sausage flatbread. I would say 6 out of 10. It was good, but it was just a bit plain. Lunchtime, the dumplings. I'm going to give these 9 out of 10. They were excellent. The dough was a little bit thick, but I don't mind that. And I would definitely make those again. They were so tasty. Dinner, beans on toast, 5 out of 10. It was okay, but really the beans were masking the poor texture of the bread. Day 2, banana sandwich, 3 out of 10. It was really pretty dire. If that had been dipped in egg before frying and then dusted with nutmeg and sugar, that would have been fantastic. And if it had been just fried in butter and served with maple syrup, that would have been great. But it wasn't. And like this, it was very conspicuously lacking something. Lunch on day 2, my pasty, I'm going to give that 8 out of 10. That was very, very good. It had a lot of pastry, but I actually really enjoyed the weird hybrid bread pastry that I made. The filling was satisfying and really tasty, and it was really nice to have something that I could take out and eat outdoors like this. That fluffy pastry kept the filling warm for nearly an hour. And dinner on day 2, the pasta dish, I'm going to give that 7 out of 10. It was good. The texture of the noodles was a bit on the soft side, but in a way that worked. That sauce was absolutely jammed with flavour from all that reduced broth and the onion weeds and the bacon. But I would have liked a little dash of tomato in that, if only for colour. So I hope that's been interesting. That was my £2 for 2 days budget challenge. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.